The Hollybush Inn is a pub we have called into on many occasions over the years. Heading back to the Black Country from some part of Worcestershire, we have cycled through the hamlet of Hartle, past the site of Galton's mill, up the hill to the former Four Winds, and over the main road to enjoy a nice beer or two. This provides suitable for refreshment and fortification for the lovely ride up Shut Mill Lane, a route for all seasons from bluebells in spring to rich autumnal colours later in the year. The pub was fenced off in early 2025 and we thought our visits had come to an end. We cycled past a few times to check on progress as the new owners were refurbishing the building. Would they ruin it, we wondered. However, despite being upgraded for the modern consumer, there remains some pub tradition inside. But what about the beer? After all, that's the main reason for us to go into a pub. It turns out that the real ale offering is better than ever, and since reopening in June 2025, we have enjoyed some top-notch beers. The pub regularly serves beers from the Black Country such as Fixed Wheel at Blackheath and Holden's of Woodsetton. Ales from 3 Tons at Bishop's Castle can often be seen at the servery, along with beers from Church-End Brewery based near Atherstone in Warwickshire. Casting the net further afield, the cellar has also seen casks from the likes of Castle Rock at Nottingham, Thornbridge Brewery near Bakewell and Abbeydale of Sheffield. From the opening, the bar manager ensuring the ales were in tip-top shape was Nick, a Gornal bloke we had previously encountered running the bar at the Sandler's Brewery Tap in the Lye. The owners of the new-look Hollybush are brothers Darren and Jamie MacDonald, seen here with their head chef Gary. Hailing from the Lye, the MacDonalds operate successful tyre and exhaust centres in the Black Country. The Hollybush represented a new challenge for them, neither having run a pub before. However, having been on the other side of the counter for many years, they had an idea of what they wanted. As they have stated on their web page, there's no great secret or master plan behind it. We simply tried to create the sort of pub that we would want to visit ourselves. The kitchen of the Hollybush has a bit of a Black Country theme, such as faggots and peas and fish and chips, with the hostelry becoming famous for their Boston cobs. Looking at the plates coming from the kitchen, these look to be heavier than our bikes. We'd struggle to get up Walton Hill if we partook in these doorstoppers. If we had cycled up Shut Mill Lane in the mid-Edwardian period, we might have been delayed by the blokes undertaking some logging or woodland management. The men in this photograph look like they might have needed some refreshment at the Hollybush Inn. It appears that a couple of trees have been felled and are ready for loading onto a heavy wagon. The horses would be doing a bit of work if they were going up towards Walton Hill. Shut Mill is over the parish boundary in Romsley. The mill is thought to date back to the 13th century when the abbot of Halesowen ordered its construction. The abbot also insisted that his tenants grind their corn here too. Corn was produced at the mill almost until its closure in 1886. In recent times, a double garage stood on the site of the original mill. In 1926, the house was purchased by the noted geologist Professor Leonard Johnston Wills. He ingeniously installed a turbine on the stream to provide electricity for the house. He also owned Farley Cottage, thought to have been the home of the scythe maker John Melly, who died in 1605. Professor Wills once hoped that Farley Cottage would be converted into a geological field studies centre, but following its sale, the money was used to found a similar research establishment in Somerset. Also captured during the Edwardian period, this photograph of a crowd outside the Hollybush was used for the production of picture postcards, the front of which had the slogan, "Returning from the Fair." Judging by the fine weather, this photograph was possibly captured after the Midsummer Horse and Pleasure Fair held annually at Bromsgrove. As it was on a picture postcard, the scene was probably captured in the early Edwardian years. The weather for the 1905 fair was particularly fine, whereas in 1907 there was much rain. The post-fair report suggested that 1904 was poorly attended, the ground presenting an almost deserted appearance, so perhaps this dates from 1905. It is possible that these people have travelled from Stourbridge on the Great Western Railway bus service and are transferring to carriages in order to complete their journey to Bromsgrove. However, the fair continued throughout the day and into the evening, so why are there so many people here during the day? Whatever the case, it looks like the Hollybush Inn enjoyed good trade, along with Jacob Davenport on the opposite side of the lane, who would have operated some of the carriages. Of course, the light conditions in June would have facilitated an early evening photograph, so perhaps these folks were indeed returning from the fair. Though located on what is a very old road, the Hollybush only opened as a beer house in the early years of Queen Victoria's reign. The origins of the premises are rather sketchy, but the 1841 census shows that the property was occupied by the scythe grinder William Small, along with his wife Mary. Their son, also named William, was an apprentice baker. In the absence of a suitable power source, I imagine that William Small undertook this work at one of the forges in the village, a centre of a thriving scythe-making industry. Perhaps he made the short journey down the hill to Galton's mill. This was occupied by John Savage in the 16th century and leased to Farmer and Galton, gunmakers of Birmingham. Thought to be the oldest in the country, the surviving cast-iron mill wheel was installed by Samuel Galton in 1793. The mill was taken over by Isaac Nash in 1846 and used for scythe grinding until 1942. On an Ordnance Survey map published in 1884, the cartographer placed the term Hollies Hill on the uncultivated piece of land to the southwest. The name is said to have been applied due to the proliferation of holly bushes on that site, though some have put forward an etymological theory based on the Hollier family of Hagley. The map also showed the milestone to the southeast, showing that the Hollybush Inn was almost equidistant from Stourbridge and Bromsgrove. The milestone would have been placed by the Turnpike Trust responsible for the route's maintenance. The origins of this turnpike can be traced back to the Hagley and Birmingham Road Act of 1753, forming part of a route from Wordesley through Stourbridge, Old Swinford and Hagley. Road improvements would be rolled out after this Act of Parliament, the earliest work being undertaken in and around Stourbridge. The road on which the Hollybush stands was already an important route, said to have been a saltway from Droitwich to Penkridge. Before the days of the dual carriageway, the road passed through Holy Cross and Lower Clent, and next to the Littleton Arms at Hagley. The area around Hollies Hill bore evidence of early settlement, including a Norman chapel near Bell Hall. Although subsequently altered, particularly in the 17th century, the chapel is thought to date from around 1200. Around 500 metres north of the Hollybush Inn, Moor Hall was once a moated house of some antiquity. The present house dates from around 1680, but was constructed on an old site. Once known as Moor Hall Beln, it was an ancient seat of the Tristrams. Also, not too far away at Fen Farm, when digging a drain in 1833 for the Green family, a Roman jar containing more than 100 coins of the early Roman emperors was unearthed. Some of the coins bore the impress of Adrian, Antonius Pius, Marcus Aurelius Antonius, the Gordians and Philip. Now, before you rock up to the Hollybush Inn dressed as Mackenzie Crook or Toby Jones in Detectorists and start digging up the beer garden, be advised that one would have to find a skipful of such coins to bank a life-changing fortune. Coins featuring Antonius Pius and Marcus Aurelius Antonius have been spotted on eBay for as little as £100 each. Alternatively, the odd coin or two found next to your garden table could be exchanged at the bar for a pint of beer and a bag of scratchings. The Turnpike Road was possibly a valuable part of the area's infrastructure for those engaged in the scythe-making industry. The Duke of Wellington's Beer House Act of 1830 meant that the financial risk for a potential publican was minimised. Perhaps it was these combined factors that tempted William Small to try his luck by opening his door to the public, hoping that there was sufficient overspill demand from the long-established Bell Inn at Bell End and the Bell and Cross Inn at Holy Cross, once known just as the Cross Inn. So if this was the case, it would seem that William Small combined his trade of scythe grinder with the role of beer-house keeper, and if so, his wife would have played a key role whilst he was toiling at the forge. Born locally in the 1790s, the electoral rolls seem to indicate that William Small held the freehold of the house and garden under his own occupation. Now, I have not stated that Hollybush definitely existed as a beerhouse during this period, though some suggest that William Small was the first publican. He possibly was, but unless I see definite proof, I never state it as a fact. It is interesting to note that the Billings Directory and Gazetteer, published in 1850, does not include a listing for William Small as a beer retailer at Hollies Hill. He did live here, but I have yet to find evidence that he was actually a beer retailer. At this time, Samuel Farmer occupied Moor Hall Farm, and the Lee family lived at the neighbouring Gorse Farm. The directory does include a listing for Thomas Small as a baker and shopkeeper. I imagine that is where William and Mary Small's son served his apprenticeship. On page 1154 of the Post Office Directory for Worcestershire, published by Kelly & Co. in 1860, the location of Thomas Small's shop was given as Hollies Hill. Another name to leap off the page in that directory is that of George Hadgkiss, a man listed as a coal dealer and beer retailer. His premises was between the Bell Inn and Castle Bourne, close to where there is a petrol station in the 21st century. His beer house was known as the Halfway House Inn. The premises, like the Hollybush Inn, was an outlet once for Walker's ales brewed at Burton-on-Trent. It can be seen here with a convoy of wagons used for a festive occasion, perhaps a celebration of a coronation given the Union Jack flags being waved. The halfway house was badly damaged during a hurricane storm on February the 1st, 1868. A large elm tree fell with great violence upon the roof of the beer house and caused considerable damage to the building. However, the newspaper report stated that the patrons, described as inmates, escaped uninjured. Returning to Hollies Hill, I believe that shopkeeper Thomas Small was the younger brother of William. On checking baptism records, a Thomas Small had the same parents, John and Eleanor. Mary Small, the wife of William, died in 1847, and the scythe grinder passed away in August 1860 at the age of 68. I wonder if it was his son who first sold beer on the premises. If so, it was only for a short period. In the census conducted during the following year, he was recorded here at Hollies Hill and listed as a retired publican. At 31 years of age, it was a little early to retire. He was living with his in-laws, the scythe business having been taken over by his father-in-law, William Christopher. He had operated a similar business at Netherton in the Black Country, which is where Mary Ann, wife of William Small, was born. I have not perused any legal documents for this property, but it has crossed my mind that the scythe grinding business was perhaps conducted across the other side of Gorse Green Lane, and that the Hollybush Inn was the former bakery and shop. Certainly the large Christopher family were in residence in the property listed next to the pub. In 1861, the name of the Hollybush Inn appears for the first time in the census. The beer house was occupied by Thomas and Sarah Millichap. The Clent-born publican was listed as a beer house keeper with no other trade. Sarah Millichap hailed from Bromsgrove. One of the small cottages that formed part of the row with the Hollybush Inn was occupied by the Bowen family, who were engaged in the tailoring trade. Before discussing the Millichap couple, it is worth looking at William and Mary Ann Small, because they continued a life together in the licensed trade in another pocket of Worcestershire. They headed to Cookley, where they kept the Eagle and Spur Inn, before relocating a short distance to the Bull's Head Hotel in the same village. The Bull's Head Hotel can be seen in this image, showing an omnibus parked by the extended frontage. They remained at the Bull's Head for some years, where William Small was also recorded as a farmer of 120 acres and employer of 3 agricultural labourers. William Small would become the proprietor of the Bull Brewery at Cuckley, developing and refining home brewing skills he first attempted here at the Hollybush Inn. An 1862 auction notice published in Barrow's Worcester Journal showed that the pub was furnished with good brewing plant acquired by Thomas Millichap when he became tenant of the house. He was possibly funded by his father, a straw and coal dealer at Bumble Hole near Bourneheath and Catshill. For whatever reason, perhaps failure, lack of brewing expertise, or simply not liking the trade, the tenure of the Millichaps was brief and they decided to sell up. 10 years later they were recorded in Pickford Street at Stretford in Lancashire, where Thomas Millichap was documented as a grocer and provision dealer. Perhaps it was this form of retailing that had attracted him to the Hollybush Inn. An example of the increasing social mobility of the Victorians, by 1881 the family had returned to the Midlands and were living in Handsworth. Middle-aged Thomas Millichap had, by this period in his career, become an omnibus driver. Following his death in 1884, widow Sarah Millichap converted their home in Bolton Road into a lodging house. Benjamin Cutler was running the Hollybush Inn by May 1864. In that month he was charged by Superintendent Freeman, Inspector of Weights and Measures for the Stourbridge district, for unjust measures. Benjamin Cutler, who also traded as a hay and straw dealer, sounds a bit of a rogue. In the previous month at the Stourbridge Public Office he was charged with stealing a churn stand and 2 chairs, the property of Samuel Cope at Kinver. A sale of farming stock had taken place there on March 14th, where the publican bought some straw and clover. After the removal of the straw, the chairs and churn stand were missed, and on Police Constable Biddulph going to the Hollybush Inn, he found the items at the pub. Cutler accounted for them by saying that when he went to remove the straw he found them amongst it, and considered he was entitled to them. He was remanded for a week, but admitted to bail. When the publican of the Hollybush reappeared before the magistrates at Wordsley, he was honourably acquitted and left the court with an unblemished character. It was stated that he bought the lot in which were the churn stand and chairs. The auctioneer bore testimony to such. He told the magistrates that Benjamin Cutler was justified in removing the goods with the straw. Though I am not 100%, I think that this may have been the same Benjamin Cutler who had previously traded as a hay and straw dealer near the old chapel at Holy Cross Green. The same occupation seems too much of a coincidence. If so, after running the Hollybush during the 1860s, he and his wife Harriet took up market gardening in Broome before relocating to Newhouse Farm at Bluntington near Chadsley Corbett. It was there that he died in January 1878. One of their sons, also named Benjamin, died in unusual circumstances 11 years later. He had remained in Holy Cross where he operated a butchery. He passed away after being in agony for 5 days following a tremendous kick in the stomach from his horse. This took place in the stable, and the butcher did manage to clamber over the stable's half door before collapsing in the yard. He lay there unconscious for around 3 hours before being discovered by his wife when she returned home. In late December 1867, Thomas Good, a dealer in coal and breezes, was found dead at the roadside near the Hollybush Inn. He had left his home at Fairfield in his usual health to fetch a load from Stourbridge, and in the afternoon he was found sitting by the roadside, apparently asleep, but in reality dead, with his horse near him, grazing. The local doctor, Robert Louis Raymond, was sent for, but there was little to be done for the poor fellow. It would have been logical to hold the coroner's inquest at the Hollybush, but for some reason the body was taken to the wagon and horses in Fairfield. At the inquest the coroner, R. Docker, stated that the death had resulted from disease of the heart, and a verdict to that effect was returned. In the early 1870s, the elderly Thomas Small was still trading as a grocer here at Hollies Hill. This could have been in the end cottage at the row comprising the Hollybush Inn, which by this period was being kept by Thomas and Mary Ann Andrews. The couple were running the place in July 1870 as William and Mary Hill, both infant children from Mary Ann's previous marriage, died here of scarlet fever. She had been widowed and married Thomas Andrews at Birmingham in September 1866. It is perhaps an indication of how much trade the Hollybush was doing at this time that Thomas Andrews was still going out to work in the fields as an agricultural labourer. Mind you, this was the graft he was used to, as he was part of a family who all worked as farm labourers in his hometown of Arrow in Warwickshire. His wife, Mary Ann, originally Smith, hailed from Rubery. The long arm of the judicial system caught up with Thomas Andrews in 1871 when he was made to appear before the Board of Guardians for Ulster to explain why he had not contributed towards the support of his mother, Hannah. He was ordered to pay 1 shilling and 6pence weekly towards her maintenance. Thomas and Mary Ann Andrews spent the early part of the 1870s at the Hollybush Inn, but departed in 1873 to take over at the Nailers' Arms at Bourne Heath. The licence of the latter was transferred to Thomas Andrews at the Petty Sessions held on June the 3rd of that year. The couple would spend donkey's years running the Nailers' Arms. As an elderly widow, Mary Ann was still in charge of that hostelry in the 1920s. The licence of the Hollybush Inn was transferred from Thomas Smith to Charles Cox in December 1878. The latter was probably involved at the Bell and Cross Inn at Clent, a pub once run by his father and son of the Cox clan. 3 years later, on January the 15th, 1881, at the police court, the licence was transferred to William Kimberley. The Kidderminster-born publican kept the beer house with his wife Mary Ann. Trade must have been on the up, as they had a living servant. Things seem to have come around in some sort of circle, because Mary Ann was the daughter of the aforementioned William Small of the Bull's Head Hotel at Cuckley. This suggests to me that, although plenty of tenants had come and gone at Hollies Hill, the freehold of the property was still being held by William Small. Indeed, after their spell running the Hollybush, the family would move to Cuckley, from where William Kimberley resumed his career as a clerk. There was an auction of property at Hollies Hill that did not include the Hollybush Inn, just the adjacent buildings, all of which were probably occupied by patrons of the pub over the years. The notice by the auctioneers Cotton and Dipple provides excellent detail on the properties along with the names of the occupants. They were tenants to the freeholder, and it was the combined houses that were being sold as one lot following the death of John Raybould. The auction was held at the nearby Bell Inn at Bell End on April 29, 1889, and was well attended. The bidding started at £200, and after some spirited competition, the hammer fell to Noah Raybould at £355. Of course, he would hope that the combined rents from the tenants would provide more than the annual interest he would gain if he placing his £355 in a savings account. That's capitalism, folks. Looking at the rental income at the time of the sale, I suspect the occupants were about to see a little increase in their payments to Noah Raybould. These included William Martin, a scythe setter and local preacher. He lived here with his wife Priscilla and 4 young daughters. In the early 1890s, the Hollybush Inn was kept by William and Emma Jennings, a couple from very different parts of the country, but whose life paths crossed in Worcestershire. William Jennings was born in Ribbenhall near Bewdley in 1839, and in his early years worked as a miller. The daughter of a baker, Emma Baker, hailed from London. They were married at Kidderminster in December 1858. After settling in the carpet town, William's work took him to Coventry. I'm not sure of the exact date they moved into the Hollybush, but as can be seen from page 19 of Kelly's Directory for Worcestershire, published in 1892, they were also running the long-standing shop. The couple would also run the Robin Hood Inn and Hop Pole Inn at Kidderminster, but in later years kept the Ivy House Inn at Catshill. They were both in their 70s when still pulling pints of beer at the Ivy House. Both of them died at the house in 1917. They were succeeded at the Ivy House Inn by their son Charles. Before being called up for service as a farrier in World War I, he had been publican and shoeing-smith at the Bridge Inn at Tiverton. The aforementioned trade directory of 1892 showed the name of Timothy Parish at Hayes Farm. He had used the land outside the Hollybush Inn to auction animals and plant. On the morning of Tuesday, April the 28th, 1891, 22-year-old Charles Darby, employed by Timothy Parish at the Hayes, was on top of a load of hay, securing it with a rope, when the cord broke. Charles Darby fell headlong to the ground. As the poor chap had no feeling in the lower half of his body, it was supposed that the fall had broken his back. Dr. Hobbs attended him, but could not save his life. Darby died about 1 o'clock on the following morning at his home in Bell End. Another local resident to die young was Thomas Foxall. The son of sidesmith John Foxall, who lived across the other side of the old turnpike road, he joined the 2nd Worcestershire Regiment in 1896. After a year's service in Bermuda, he sailed to the Cape on December the 12th, 1899. He served under General Clements and took part in the infamous march of 200 miles from Norvalspont to Bloemfontein, which was effected in 14 days. At Bloemfontein, Thomas Foxall, with a number of others, was struck down with enteric fever and was removed to Cape Town, where he died on the 14th of May 1900, aged 23 years. William and Emma Jennings moved out of the Hollybush Inn during the late Victorian period. However, their son Leonard, working as a hairdresser, remained as a boarder. In 1901, the Hollybush Inn was being run by Thomas Randall, along with his wife Elizabeth, a woman who tended to use her middle name of Emma. They had earlier lived in Shutmill Cottage, from where Cotswolds-born Thomas Randall worked as a gamekeeper. The couple seemed to disappear in the Edwardian period. I think they may have emigrated to Australia. The Hollybush Inn was being operated by a large brewery by 1902. In June of that year, plans were approved for a scullery and outbuildings for Peter Walker and Son Limited. This company was founded by Peter Walker, an inventor who patented the Burton Union system, though it has to be said there is some doubt as to whether he actually was the inventor. The company operated as Peter Walker and Son in both Liverpool and Warrington. His eldest son, Sir Andrew Barclay Walker, merged his own operations into this and expanded to Burton-on-Trent. It was from there that beers could be transported via the canal network to depots in Birmingham and the Black Country for onward distribution to towns and villages in Worcestershire. There was another dreadful accident outside the Hollybush Inn when Albert Rutter, son of a market gardener of Madeley Heath, up the road from the Bell Inn, was driving a horse and cart past the pub with a full load of turnips. For some reason, the horse shied at some timber and bolted. It was later reported that Albert Rutter had no power with the reins on such a loaded lorry. Consequently, he jumped off to get at the horse's head, and in doing so either stumbled or was knocked down, and according to the original account of the accident, the lorry wheel passed over his head, inflicting shocking injuries to the face and jaw. An elder brother, Thomas Rutter, along with his wife, were on the lorry at the time of the accident. She jumped off the vehicle, but her husband remained in position. The horse stopped after going 200 or 300 yards. Police Constable Smith was at hand and rendered first aid, and arranged for Albert Rutter's prompt removal to Corbett Hospital at Amblecote, where his injuries were attended to. His jaw was fractured in several places, but the young man, despite being in a critical condition, remained conscious throughout. At the hospital, the medical opinion favoured the view that the injuries to Albert Rutter were caused by a kick of the horse rather than the wheel of the vehicle. I was pleased to find that Albert Rutter survived his ordeal, and during the following year married Bertha Davis. His first name was Frank, but was seemingly better known by his middle name. He continued as a market gardener at the Gutter in nearby Madeley Heath, where he and Bertha had a large family. He lived a long life, passing away in April 1964. Dating from the early Edwardian period, this photograph shows the houses close to the Hollybush Inn, the aforementioned property sold at auction in April 1889 to Noah Raybould of Drayton. His daughter Sarah Alice married in the following year to Jacob Leonard Davenport. They would move into the house on the corner from where Jacob worked as a horsebreaker. Jacob Davenport may have featured in this photograph with the pony and trap. The mode of transport that would put a dent in his livelihood had pulled up outside the premises. Operated by the Great Western Railway, this bus service connecting Stourbridge and Belbroughton first operated in February 1905. I have photographs of this early bus service close to the Chequers Inn at Stourbridge, stopping outside the Woodman Hotel at Lower Clent and parked up next to the Talbot Hotel in the centre of Belbroughton. The route was an immediate success, so the Great Western Railway ramped up the number of buses to operate through Pedmore, Hagley and Clent to Belbroughton. Within a few months of the first bus to trundle along the route, it was announced that the daily service from Stourbridge Town Railway Station was to be increased from 7 to 13 journeys. In addition, the Sunday service was to be increased from 4 to 7 journeys. Oh, to have such a service in the 21st century! The company also added parcel service to the route. It was a no-brainer really. It was cheaper than building a railway line, and it meant that those living in outlying parishes could travel and connect to rail services operated by the Great Western Railway. Wikipedia is generally excellent, and I regularly donate to its upkeep. However, like the AI bot stuff, everything should be double-checked. The creation of Jimmy Wales states that the Great Western Railway bus service ran from Stourbridge to Bromsgrove in February 1905. However, it was 4 years later that the route was finally extended to Bromsgrove. I learned this from an article on page 8 of the Bromsgrove, Droitwich and Redditch Weekly Messenger, published on Saturday, May the 8th, 1909. Returning to four legs from four wheels, the horsebreaker Jacob Davenport possibly damaged his reputation as an expert in equine behaviour, for he had two well-publicised accidents in the early Edwardian period. In October 1903, the son of a local farmer met with an accident near Clent Post Office. The horse trainer was driving a colt from Stourbridge in his training gig in the early evening when the horse appeared to have shied and bolted, colliding with a vehicle belonging to Mr. Lovett of Stourbridge. Jacob Davenport was pitched out and sustained severe injuries to the hand and face. Fortunately, Lockhart Lowe, a surgeon living at Holy Cross, was driving by and conveyed him to his surgery and stitched up a severe wound on the head. Jacob Davenport also had his nose broken and received a nasty cut on the elbow, so he was afterwards conveyed to the Bromsgrove Cottage Hospital. There were reportedly pools of blood at the scene of the accident, but the horses belonging to both vehicles were unhurt. Jacob Davenport's vehicle was smashed and the harness badly damaged. In June 1905, just over 18 months later, Jacob Davenport had another accident when driving a horse and trap. About 8 o'clock on June the 7th, he was passing the shop of Frederick Baker, a cycle dealer at Old Swinford, when his horse took fright and ran away at a rapid rate, and colliding with the curbing at the corner of the road leading to Old Swinford Church near the Crab Mill Inn. Jacob Davenport was thrown out, and the back of his head came into contact with the curbing, inflicting a nasty wound which bled profusely. His sister lived nearby, and medical aid was soon forthcoming. Edgar Collis, a local surgeon, sewed up the wound, which was of a length to require 10 stitches. The horsebreaker was afterwards conveyed home, where Lockhart Lowe once again attended him. This brings us to the period when this photograph was captured outside the Hollybush Inn. Jacob Davenport did not move into the featured premises immediately after his marriage in 1890 to Sarah Raybould. Indeed, the 1891 census shows them living apart in their family homes, Sarah at Drayton and Jacob just up the road at Giles Farm, where his mother Esther managed 54 acres of land. The family were retailing their own produce via a greengrocery business in Old Swinford, run by Jacob Davenport. Although under brewery ownership, The people running the Hollybush Inn during the early 20th century were tenants rather than managers or employees. In the Edwardian period, Thomas Bayliss was the licensee. Part of the Bayliss building industry of the village, he was born in 1877 and a blacksmith by trade. He married Minnie Jeffreys at the Church of St Leonard at Clent in August 1902. It was Minnie that had experience of running a pub, for she helped her mother, landlady of the Spring Tavern on Adams Hill, just up the road from where they had tied the knot. Perhaps the blacksmith was a patron and smitten by the barmaid. They kept the Hollybush Inn until July 1914, when they moved along the road to run the Bell Hotel at Bell End. It was there that they were visited by William "Willie" Hill, a nephew of Minnie, who was born and grown up at the same Spring Tavern. He would stay with them when on leave from the Royal Navy. He had enlisted in 1908 and served on the Temeraire and the Devonport. After taking up study of gunnery, the leading seaman took charge of a gun when serving on H.M.S. Defence. The Minotaur-class armoured cruiser was sunk in the Battle of Jutland on May 31st, 1916. Further tragedy followed during World War I when Minnie Bayliss died at the Bell Hotel at the age of 40. Thomas Bay married again in 1920 to the widow Ellen Owens. Commuting from their home in Kidderminster, he worked at the Austin Works in Longbridge for 2 decades. One of his stepsons, Wilfred Owen, after being the chief operator at the Garden Theatre at Bewdley from its opening in 1921, moved to take up a similar position at the Futurist Cinema in Kidderminster following its reopening in September 1930 after an extensive refurbishment. Returning to the Hollybush Inn, when Thomas and Minnie Bayliss left for the Bell Hotel, they handed over the keys to Richard and Annie Wyatt. The son of a glassworker, Richard Wyatt hailed from Stourbridge, where he trained as a butcher. This was a trade he would return to after the couple moved to Brierley Hill, when he took up a post of slaughterman at Marsh and Baxter's, the famous pork factory, supplying a chain of shops in the Black Country and beyond. Richard Wyatt would later run his own butcher's shop on what was a new housing estate at Codsall in Old Hill. Succeeding Richard Wyatt in 1916, Walter Bridgman kept the Hollybush Inn for a short period during World War I. He knew all about the licensed trade, as his father had been publican of several houses, including the Talbot Hotel here in Belbroughton. He had married another of the Jeffreys family that had run the Spring Tavern at Clent. Esther and Walter Bridgman would move from the Hollybush Inn to run the Swan Inn at Fairfield. The licence of the Hollybush Inn was transferred from Walter Bridgman to Sidney Portman at the Stourbridge Police Court on March 2, 1917. The scythe grinder was well known in the locality, particularly as he played for Belbroughton's football team. It sounds as though he was something of a loose cannon on the field of play. In one game against Fairfield in January 1911, he was booked by the referee Edwin Griffin of Bourne Heath. Incensed, he punched the official in the eye at the end of the game, causing a ding-dong that lasted for 5 minutes. Sidney Portman was hauled before the magistrates at Stourbridge, where he was fined 33 shillings, the bench stating they intended to stop such ruffianism. Sidney Portman kept the Hollybush Inn with his wife Eleanor. It was whilst running the pub in the summer of 1917 that they received news that one of their sons, Frank, had been wounded in the right hand and arm on June the 7th. Private Frank Portman wrote to his parents and informed them that he is going on well. Thankfully, I can report that he came back to Belbroughton in one piece. During the 1920s, there were some Brummies running the Hollybush Inn, probably as a result of the pub being taken over by Frederick Smith Limited, a brewery based in Aston. Frederick Smith started his own brewery when he was just 21. He was, however, part of a family rooted in the industry of beer production. His father, William Smith, was a master cooper before buying a beer shop in Gloucester Green. A successful publican, William was able to establish his own brewery in Aston. This was called the Model, the original brewery of this name. However, this was not the model brewery operated by son Frederick. When William Smith died in 1878, and in order to provide for a widow and 8 children, the business, including the Queen's Hotel, brewery and maltings, was sold off. Although the brewery was bought by the Atkinson's brothers, 2 of William Smith's elder sons, Thomas and Henry, were able to buy 2 of their father's pubs for themselves. Frederick Smith was only 18 years old and took the experience he had gained working with his father and became an employee at Atkinson's. After 2 more years of valuable training and experience, he went independent on August the 18th, 1880, by acquiring the neighbouring Victoria brewery. These premises were further down the Lichfield Road in Aston. Frederick Smith was a very astute businessman, and he was able to expand the business. By 1888 he had purchased adjoining land and built a larger brewery to supply an increasing number of outlets. This was called the Aston Model Brewery. In 1892 he built a 60-quarter malt house, and 3 years later the business was registered as a limited company. Continued expansion of the company included the acquisition of more public houses and an extension to the brewery. A bottling plant was added around 1898. To ensure continuity of the business, Frederick Smith sent his eldest son Frederick to study at the brewing school of the University of Birmingham. Younger son Sidney meanwhile concentrated on looking after the brewery's tied house estate. The brewery was significantly improved in 1922. In addition to new brewing plant, a fresh artesian well was sunk to increase the online volume of the noted Aston water. In 1927, King George V knighted Frederick Smith for his services to the communities of Aston and Birmingham. In this image, the livery of Frederick Smith Limited can be seen on the Hollybush Inn. Note that the front porch, which still stands in the 21st century, is visible here but not in the Edwardian photograph. This was perhaps added by the Aston Brewery. The name of Herbert Edward Heath was above the door. He was licensee between 1923 and 1927, so this provides a narrow window during which this photograph was taken. Herbert Heath was not a Brummie, though he would spend his final years at Tyseley. He was born in Bushbury to the north of Wolverhampton in 1882. He spent his early career in the boot trade. He kept the Hollybush Inn with his wife Rosa. They were the only couple to put in a decent shift during the 1920s, the licence changing hands regularly. Some stability was restored when Edgar Day became the publican in 1930. His name would remain above the door for 2 decades. Incredible, given that he was born in 1863. His wife Miriam was a young whippersnapper in comparison. When World War II broke out, she was only 63 years of age. Edgar Day was 76 years old when he finally hung up his apron for the last time. He died shortly afterwards. Alfred Eade slowly chipped away at Edgar Day's record of 20 years as licensee of the Hollybush Inn. He surpassed him in 1970 and clocked up another 2 years, handing over to Stanley Avery in 1972. He and his wife Jean would have seen quite a bit of change at Hollies Hill, not least the construction of what was called the M5 feeder road. They were also in charge of the pub when the brewery operator changed. Frederick Smith Limited were acquired by the Wolverhampton-based William Butler & Co. in 1955. Their livery can be seen in this photograph that was taken on April 6, 1965. However, the livery was outdated as William Butler & Co. Limited had been acquired by Mitchells & Butlers Limited 5 years before this image was captured. Moreover, the Smethwick-based company had merged with Bass, Ratcliffe & Gretton Limited in 1961 to form Bass, Mitchells & Butlers Limited. I guess they operated that many pubs, it would take some time for them to get round to changing the livery and signs of each property. Their estate would get much bigger in 1967 when they merged with Charrington United Brewers Limited to form Bass Charrington Limited. The 1960s was certainly a period of takeover madness in the brewing industry. Anyway, 3 years after this photograph was taken, Alfred and Jean Eads found themselves 2 foot under water in the bar of the Hollybush Inn, the result of a dreadful storm in May 1968. There was a happier event in the following year when Jean Eads was presented with a framed certificate in recognition of her 19 years of collecting for Father Hudson's. In that time, £750 had been raised at the Hollybush for the homes, mainly by Saturday night collections. The pub passed the £200 milestone in 1955 and the £500 in 1963. Alfred Eads was another of the old school. He was born in 1906, was getting on a bit when he called last orders for the final time. A former wood machinist, he had married Jean Davis at Fairfield in October 1929. Stanley Avery had only been at the Hollybush Inn for a year when he was killed after being hit by a car when crossing the road in June 1973. Born in June 1923, he had trained as draftsman before the outbreak of World War II. His father, formerly an employee at BSA Motorcycles, had a lock-up confectionery and tobacco shop in Ulster Street at Redditch, the family home being at 81 Bromfield Road, south of the town centre. Stanley Avery married Eileen Heath at Bromsgrove in the spring of 1944, the couple living in Bromfield Road. Eileen Avery died suddenly 2 years after her husband had passed away. Queen Elizabeth II's Silver Jubilee was celebrated in the Hollybush Inn when Eric and Vera Wakeman were the hosts. He hailed from the Black Country and in his early years toiled in a factory producing ship's tackle. He married Vera Foxall during the Second World War. The couple would later run the Golden Lion on the High Street at Bridge North. I do not know much about Ivy and Dennis Bromley, the couple running the place when I was living in Dorset. Ivy Bromley was licensee until her death in 1983, Dennis continuing at the pub for another 5 years. I should know more about Graham Keatley, as I used to nip in now and then when he was running the place, but as a patron you don't go in to grill the publican about his life. I think Graham Keatley hailed from Pedmore. After studying at Catering College for 2 years, he worked in a number of pubs. He started in the kitchen at the nearby Littleton Arms before taking on a managerial position. After a spell of over 7 years, he headed for Kings Winford to work at the Summerhill. He took over at the Hollybush during 1989 under a Bass M&B tenancy. In 1991, in a great shake-up of the industry, Graham seized the opportunity to buy the pub. Over the years, he improved the Hollybush and established a lower customer base. Like many a publican, he had his ups and downs. Graham had a miserable time of it on Christmas Day 1998, when he had to clear up after 6 inches of water had seeped into the pub following a flash flood. It was the 4th flood to hit the building in a year. The publican had piled sandbags in front of the door, but the water got in through the air vents. After running the pub for nearly 30 years, Graham Keatley passed away in 2018.